Caleb Hargrove hadn't opened that front door in 3 months. Not since he'd carried his boy out of it in a pine box. But at midnight in the dead of a Wyoming January, something scratched at the wood low, desperate like a wounded animal too tired to cry. He opened it. And there she was, 4 years old, barefoot in the snow, eyes wide and hollow the way eyes get when a child has learned that screaming doesn't help. He didn't think. He just pulled her inside. If this story moves you, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this little girl's story travels. The scratch came again at midnight. Caleb Hargrove was still awake. He was always still awake at that hour, sitting in the wood chair beside the cold stove with a cup of coffee, gone bitter, and a lantern burning low. He hadn't been reading. He hadn't been thinking about anything he could name. He'd just been sitting the way a man sits when the house is too quiet and sleep feels like a country he no longer has papers to enter. He heard it the first time and told himself it was a branch. Wyoming in January had a way of throwing things against walls, ice wind debris. The second time he set down his cup. The third time he stood. He crossed the main room in 4 steps, unlatched the door, and pulled it open into the black. She was standing on the porch boards with her arms wrapped around herself, wearing a cotton shift dress that might have been white once. No coat, no shoes. Her feet were pressed flat against the frozen wood, and they'd gone the color of ash. She was 4 years old maybe, small enough that the top of her head didn't reach his belt buckle. Her hair was matted and dark from melted snow plastered against a face so pale it looked carved from the same ice that covered his water trough. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked up at him with eyes the color of a winter sky, gray and enormous and completely terribly still. Caleb had seen men take bullets and hold that same expression. The look of someone who has already decided that pain is simply the cost of being alive. "Lord Almighty," he said. He picked her up. Her body was rigid with cold, her limbs stiff, and she made no sound when he lifted her, not a whimper, not a flinch. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, kicked the door shut behind him, and stood in the middle of his own floor, not entirely sure what to do next, which was an unusual feeling for a man who had spent 11 years as a federal marshal. He'd tracked killers across 4 territories. He'd sat across tables from men who smiled while describing the worst things human beings do to one another. He had never in all of that felt the particular helplessness of holding a freezing child and realizing that whatever had happened to her, it had happened slowly enough that she'd stopped fighting it. He set her in the chair closest to the stove. He got the fire going, not a careful fire, the kind of fire that lights fast and burns hot. He found the wool blanket from his bed, the heaviest one, and wrapped it around her until only her face showed. Then he knelt in front of her and took her feet in both hands and held them, pressing warmth through his palms, watching her face for any sign of pain. She watched him work without blinking. "Can you tell me your name?" he said. "Nothing." "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to." He got up and put water on to heat. He didn't have much in the kitchen worth calling food, some cornbread going stale dried jerky, a tin of peaches he'd been saving for no particular reason. He opened the peaches, poured them into a tin cup so they'd be easier to hold, and brought them back to her. She stared at the cup, then she looked up at him. "Go on," he said. "They're yours." She took the cup in both hands, tiny hands he noticed with the nails bitten down to nothing, and drank the syrup first slowly, like she wasn't sure if he was going to take it back. Then she ate the peaches one at a time, with her fingers careful and deliberate, as if each one required a separate decision. Caleb pulled the other chair across the floor and sat down a few feet away. Not too close. He'd been around enough frightened things, horses, children, people coming out of bad situations to know that closeness had to be earned, not given. "My name's Caleb," he said. "I used to be a lawman before I came here." He paused. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want you to know that. I know you've got no reason to take my word for it, but I'm going to say it anyway." She ate the last peach slice. She looked at the empty cup. "There's more," he said. "I got more." Something shifted in her face then, just barely. The faintest crack in that terrible stillness, not a smile, not even close, but something that was the distant cousin of relief. He got her more peaches. Yeah. By the time the water was warm enough, she'd stopped shaking. He helped her wash her feet carefully, the way you handle something that might break, and found 2 pairs of wool socks that he folded down at the ankle so they'd stay on. She watched him with the same calm, measuring attention throughout. Not trust exactly. More like assessment, like she was gathering data and hadn't reached a conclusion yet. "Lily," she said. Caleb looked up from her feet. "My name," she said. "It's Lily." Her voice was small and hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a while. "Lily," he repeated. "That's a good name." "Mr. Voss gave it to me," she said. "He said it was a pretty name for a pretty girl." She said it the way a child recites something they've been told to say flat and rehearsed without any feeling attached to it. Caleb kept his hands very still. "Who's Mr. Voss?" "He owns the big ranch," she said, "past the creek. Everybody knows Mr. Voss." Caleb knew the name. Harlan Voss had more acres than any man in the county, more influence than the sheriff, and a reputation for generosity in church on Sundays that the whole town seemed content to believe. He ran cattle, a little timber, a general store in Millhaven. He was the kind of man who got his name on buildings. "Does Mr. Voss know where you are?" Caleb said. Lily looked at the wool socks on her feet. She picked at a loose thread at the ankle with one finger. "He'll come looking," she said. "He always comes looking." "When did you leave his ranch?" "When it got dark." "You walked here in the dark in January." She nodded. "Barefoot." Another nod. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. His ranch was 2 miles from the Voss property. 2 miles through January snow in the dark with no shoes. He looked at her feet again, the heels, the toes, and thought about what kind of fear drives a 4-year-old child to decide that 2 miles barefoot in the dark is better than staying where she is. "Lily," he said carefully. "Did someone hurt you?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she pushed the sleeve of her cotton dress up to the elbow and held out her arm. He looked at it. He kept his face neutral with a discipline that cost him considerably more than it showed. "All right," he said. "All right." He pulled the sleeve back down gently. He tucked the blanket tighter around her. "You're safe here tonight," he said. "You hear me? You're safe." She studied his face. Those gray eyes moved across his features the way a surveyor reads terrain, slowly, methodically looking for things that don't add up. Whatever she found or didn't find, she leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. She was asleep in under 2 minutes. Caleb sat across from her and didn't move for a long time. He thought about Ruth Calloway, the doctor who ran the small practice on Millhaven's Main Street. He thought about Earl Dupree, his hired hand who slept in the bunkhouse 50 yards from the main house and would be up before dawn. He thought about what it meant that a child had walked 2 miles through a Wyoming winter night and ended up specifically at his door, and whether that was accident or something else. He thought about Harlan Voss. He'd met the man twice. Once at a town meeting about water rights, once at the general store. Both times, Voss had been exactly what his reputation suggested. Broad-shouldered, easy smiling, the kind of man who remembered names and used them often, who shook hands firmly and held eye contact a beat longer than necessary, who made you feel in the moment of his attention like you were the most important person in the room. Caleb had been a federal marshal for 11 years. He knew exactly what that kind of performance cost and who paid for it. He looked at the sleeping child in his chair. He thought about his son Thomas. 3 years old when the fever came, gone in 4 days. Caleb had sat beside that same chair, this very chair on the last night, holding a hand that had gone cold in his own talking about nothing, because there was nothing to say, because sometimes the world takes what it wants, and your words don't factor into it at all. He hadn't talked to anyone about Thomas, not to Earl, not to Ruth, who'd been there at the end and had been kind enough not to offer him any comfort he'd have had to pretend to accept. He hadn't talked about his wife Margaret either, who'd left 6 months after, not out of cruelty, but out of a grief so complete it had simply dissolved her sense of direction. And one morning he'd woken up and she was gone. And the note she left said, "I can't be here and breathe at the same time." He understood that. He didn't blame her. He just stayed because leaving felt like one more abandonment of a boy who was already past being abandoned. He looked at Lily. He always comes looking. Caleb got up. He went to the window and looked out at the dark, at the flat white fields, and the black line of the tree line, and the road that ran south toward Millhaven. Nothing moved. The night was clear and brutally cold and perfectly still. He latched the window. He checked the door. He checked the back door. He moved through the house quietly the way he used to move through buildings he wasn't sure were clear, and when he was done he came back to the main room and sat down again across from the sleeping girl. He didn't sleep. He didn't intend to. Time. Earl Dupree knocked on the back door at 5:45 in the morning, same as every day. And Caleb opened it before Earl's knuckles finished their second knock. Earl was 53. Black, built like a man who'd spent his entire life doing work that asked everything of him and had received exactly what it asked. He had a face that moved slowly, not because he was slow, but because he didn't waste expression on things that didn't earn it. He looked at Caleb. He looked past Caleb at the small shape under the blanket in the chair. "Morning," he said. "Earl," Caleb said. "Come in and close that door." Earl stepped in, closed the door, and waited. "Child showed up at midnight," Caleb said. "Barefoot, hypothermic. She walked from the Voss ranch." Earl's face moved then. "Harlan Voss." "That's right." "How old, Bay?" "4. Maybe just turned 5. Caleb paused. "She's got marks on her arm, Earl." Earl was quiet. He looked at the child. "She say anything?" "She said he always comes looking." The two men stood in the kitchen and were quiet together for a moment, in the particular way of men who don't need to perform their thinking out loud. "I'm going for Ruth," Caleb said. "Before it gets light enough for anyone to be moving on the road. I need you to stay here. Don't open the door for anyone. I mean anyone. You understand me?" "I understand you." "If Voss or anyone from his crew comes by—" "I'll tell them I haven't seen a soul," Earl said. "And I'll be telling the truth because I was in the bunkhouse all night, and I don't know a single thing about whatever happened in this house." Caleb looked at him. "You sure?" Earl looked back with the patience of a man who has been underestimated enough times that the question no longer surprised him. "Caleb, go get the doctor." Ruth Calloway answered her door on the second knock, wearing her coat already buttoned, as if she'd heard the horse on the road, and made her own calculation about who it would be and what they'd need. She was 61, thin as wire, with white hair she kept pinned up, and brown eyes that had developed over decades of practice, the ability to assess a situation without giving away what the assessment found. Caleb had barely finished the third sentence before she was reaching for her bag. "You rode through town?" she said, moving fast. "Stayed off the main road." "Good." She snapped the bag shut. "Anyone see you?" "Not that I could tell." "Harlan Voss has friends at the sheriff's office," she said. "Wade Pruitt's been in his pocket for 2 years, maybe longer." "I know." "You should also know," Ruth said, pulling her door shut and locking it behind her, "that this is not the first time I've heard that name in connection with a child." Caleb stopped on her front steps. "Say that again." Ruth looked at him directly. In the pre-dawn dark, her breath came in small white clouds. "There was a boy 2 years ago, 7 years old. His mother brought him to me with injuries she couldn't explain. When I asked questions, she stopped bringing him." She paused. 3 weeks later she left town. No forwarding address. The boy went with her. Another pause. Or so I was told. The space between them filled up with the implications of that last sentence. "You think she left on her own?" Caleb said. "I think," Ruth said carefully, "that I have never been able to confirm it either way." Caleb stood very still in the dark outside Ruth Calloway's door and felt something settle in his chest that was neither anger nor grief, but the particular cold clarity that used to come over him before a situation that was going to require everything he had. "Let's go," he said.
"Get him there."
Lily woke up when Ruth came through the door, and she did what Caleb had been half afraid she'd do. She pulled herself into the corner of the chair, both feet up, knees to her chest, eyes tracking Ruth with an alertness that had no childhood in it at all. "Easy," Caleb said, crouching down so he was below her eye level. "This is Ruth. She's a doctor. She's a friend of mine. She's going to help." "She works for Mr. Voss," Lily said. "No," Caleb said. "She doesn't work for anyone but herself." Lily looked at Ruth for a long moment. Ruth stood still and let herself be looked at, which told Caleb something about Ruth he'd already suspected. "Does it hurt?" Lily finally said. Not to either of them in particular, just into the room. "Does what hurt?" Ruth asked. "When you fix things," Lily said. "Does it hurt?" Ruth set her bag down on the floor and sat down on the edge of the hearth, bringing herself level with the child. "Sometimes," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that, but I'll tell you before I do anything, and I'll stop if you ask me to." Lily considered this. "All right," she said. She let Ruth examine her. She was quiet throughout that same eerie composure, that same absence of protest, and Caleb stood in the corner of the room and watched and kept his hands loose at his sides and worked to maintain the expression of a man who is simply observing and not one who is cataloging every item he intends to answer for. When Ruth was finished, she repacked her bag with careful, deliberate movements. She didn't look at Caleb right away. When she did, she tilted her head slightly toward the kitchen. "Earl," Caleb said, "can you sit with her for a minute?" Earl came in from where he'd been waiting by the back wall. He had a way of being present without imposing on a space that Caleb had always admired. He brought a second tin cup of peach syrup and offered it to Lily without making a production of it, and Lily took it and held it in both hands and watched him the way she'd watched everything, carefully gathering data, and he sat down across from her and didn't say a word. In the kitchen, Ruth spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "4 distinct bruises on the upper arm consistent with adult finger grip," she said. "Healed laceration on the left shoulder, probably 3 weeks old. Burns on the right palm here and here." She marked the spots on her own hand, consistent with something hot being pressed deliberately against the skin. She stopped. "And she's malnourished. Not starved, but not fed properly either. Not for some time." Caleb said nothing. "She's resilient," Ruth said. "Children often are. It's not a comfort." "No," Caleb agreed. "Caleb." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Harlan Voss is the legal guardian of that child. He has documents. The county judge signed them 18 months ago. If he comes here..." "He'll come here," Caleb said. "When he does, the law is on his side. Wade Pruitt will enforce it." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Caleb looked through the kitchen doorway at the small figure in the chair holding the tin cup, watching Earl with those measuring gray eyes. "I'm going to make sure," he said slowly, "that when Harlan Voss walks through that door, he does not walk back out with that child." Ruth studied him. "And how exactly do you plan to do that within the law?" "I spent 11 years as a federal marshal," Caleb said. "I know every way there is to do something within the law, and I know a few ways the law hasn't figured out yet." He paused. "But first, I need to know who signed those guardianship papers and why, and I need to know what happened to that boy 2 years ago, and I need to know if there's anyone else." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara Heston." "Who?" "She worked the Voss Ranch for 4 years, cook and house staff. She left abruptly last spring, and she's been living with her sister on the east side of town ever since." Ruth paused. "She doesn't go out much. She doesn't talk about why she left." Another pause. "But I've seen her face when Voss's name comes up in conversation, and I've been a doctor long enough to know what that kind of expression means." Caleb nodded once. I'll need to talk to her. She may not talk to you. She will, he said, not arrogantly, just with the flat certainty of a man who has spent his life in rooms with people who didn't want to talk and had learned slowly and at some cost how to make them feel safe enough to do it anyway. Ruth looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded. What do you need from me? Document everything you found, Caleb said. Every mark, every measurement, every detail. Date it. Sign it. Keep a copy somewhere Voss can't get to. He held her gaze. And Ruth, if anyone asks you where you were this morning, you went for an early ride. You haven't been to my property in 2 weeks. Ruth picked up her bag. I went for an early ride, she said. I haven't been to your property in 2 weeks. She went back into the main room, said something quiet to Lily that made the child look up at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was something adjacent to it, and then she was gone out the back door into the early gray light of a Wyoming morning. Caleb stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. Somewhere south of here at the big ranch, past the creek, Harlan Voss was going to wake up and discover that a small girl was missing. And then he was going to start making the kinds of calls that men with his kind of money and influence make when the world doesn't arrange itself the way they expect. Caleb thought about a pine box. He thought about a note on a kitchen table. He thought about 11 years of riding toward danger and the way his hands used to be steady in the worst moments and the way they were still steady now, even after everything, even with all of it. He thought about Lily's arm. He went back into the main room. Lily, he said. She looked up from the tin cup. Nobody is taking you anywhere today, he said. You understand me, nobody. She studied his face for a long moment with those terrible, careful eyes. Then she said, You promise. And Caleb Hargrove, who had not made a promise to anyone in 3 years, said, Yes, I promise. The promise hung in the air between them like smoke after a gunshot. Lily looked at him for 3 full seconds. Those gray eyes doing their slow, careful work, and then she turned back to the tin cup and finished the last of the syrup. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Something in the set of her small shoulders had changed just slightly, the way a door changes when the latch finally catches. Caleb pulled on his coat. Earl, he said, I'm going into town. I need you to keep her inside and keep the curtains drawn. If anyone rides up anyone at all, you don't answer. Earl looked up from where he'd settled himself across from Lily, elbows on knees, calm as a man waiting out weather. And if they don't take no answer for an answer, then you come to the back window and fire twice into the air, Caleb said. I'll hear it from the road. Earl nodded once. How long you planning to be? Long as it takes. He looked at Lily one more time before he went out. She was watching him over the rim of the cup, not afraid, not pleading, just watching the way she'd watched everything since she'd arrived at his door. Like she was memorizing him. Like she'd learned somewhere along the way to memorize people fast in case they disappeared. He didn't let himself think about that too long. He rode into Millhaven with the morning light still thin and gray, and the main street empty enough that his horse's hooves sounded loud against the frozen ground. He went east first, away from the sheriff's office, away from the general store that had Voss's name above the door down the narrow side street, where the houses sat close together and smoke was just beginning to rise from the chimneys. Clara Heston's sister lived in the 3rd house on the left. Ruth had told him that much. He knocked. A woman answered who was clearly not Clara. Older, broader, with a flour-dusted apron, and the expression of someone who had spent considerable time fielding visits they didn't ask for. I'm looking for Clara Heston, Caleb said. My name's Caleb Hargrove. I've got a ranch 2 miles north of the Voss property. The woman's expression didn't change. Clara doesn't take visitors. I know, Caleb said. I'm not here on a social call. He paused. There's a child, 4 years old. She showed up at my door last night. I need to understand what she walked away from. The woman in the doorway went very still. From somewhere inside the house a voice said, Maud, let him in. Clara Heston was 34 and looked older. She was sitting at a kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she didn't stand up when Caleb came in, which told him something about the state she was living in. She had the posture of someone who'd been holding themselves together by main force for so long that the effort had become invisible even to her. She looked at him. "A little girl," she said. "Dark hair, gray eyes." "That's right." Clara set down the coffee cup. Her hands stayed on the table, and Caleb noticed they were shaking very slightly. "I wondered," she said. "When I heard she was placed there, I wondered how long before—" She stopped, started again. "Her name is Lily. He told everyone she was his ward, an orphan he was caring for out of Christian charity." Her voice carried no inflection whatsoever on those last two words. "How long was she at the ranch?" Caleb said. 18 months, maybe a little more. And before that, I don't know where he found her," Clara said. "I only know what I saw after." She looked at the table. "I tried to protect her when I could, kept her out of his way, made sure she ate, but I was—" She stopped again. "I was afraid. I am not proud of that. But I was afraid." "Why did you leave?" Clara looked up at him. Something moved through her face that was specific and complete, and answered the question more fully than any words would have. "All right," Caleb said quietly. "I understand." "You can't understand," Clara said, "but I'll tell you anyway." She pulled in a breath. "Last March there was a boy, 12 years old, working the ranch for the summer. After 2 weeks I could see something was wrong. I told Harlan I was concerned. I told him the boy looked unwell." She paused. 3 days later the boy was gone. Harlan told me his family had come for him. I asked to see them leave. He smiled at me. That smile he has, that wide, generous smile, and he said, "Clara, why would you need to see that?" And I knew right then that if I stayed another week, something would happen that I could never untell myself. The kitchen was quiet. "She's safe right now," Caleb said. "I need her to stay safe, and I need to know, is there anything you saw? Anything you can speak to that would hold up in front of a judge?" Clara laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. "Judge Whitmore signed those guardianship papers himself," she said. "Him and Harlan go back 20 years. Hunting trips, poker games, land deals." She shook her head. "You're going to walk into that courthouse, and what exactly are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out what Whitmore's signature is worth," Caleb said. "And then I'm going to find out what it costs to make it worth less." Clara stared at him. "You don't know what he's like when someone challenges him," she said. "You don't know what he does." "I know what he does," Caleb said steadily. "I've known men like Voss my entire career. I know exactly what they do when they feel threatened. They come at you through every system. They own the law, the money, the reputation." He leaned forward slightly. "But here's what they don't know how to do, Clara. They don't know how to handle someone who's already lost everything and isn't afraid of them." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "What have you lost?" "My son," Caleb said. 3 years ago. And my reason to stay careful after that." The silence stretched. Then Clara Heston said, "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove. I'm going to tell you everything I saw." He was back at the ranch by mid-morning, and before he'd gotten his horse unsaddled, he heard it hoofbeats from the south road, more than one horse coming fast. He didn't run. He finished with the horse, latched the stall, and walked out of the barn at a steady pace. 3 riders had already pulled up in front of the house. The one in the middle was Harlan Voss. Caleb had remembered him as large, but he'd underestimated it. Voss was 6'3", at least broad across the chest, with the kind of physical confidence that came from a lifetime of never having been told no in any room he'd walked into. He was wearing a heavy coat, and his hat was tilted against the morning glare, and he was smiling. That wide, generous smile. "Caleb Hargrove," Voss said, like they were old friends encountering each other at a social. "Been meaning to ride out and properly introduce myself. I think we've only met the once." "Twice," Caleb said. "Twice, that's right." Voss nodded pleasantly. "I've got a situation on my hands this morning. One of my wards has gone missing. Little girl about 4 years old. Dark hair. You haven't seen her by any chance?" "Can't say I have," Caleb said. Voss looked at him. The smile didn't move. That's a shame. She's a timid little thing, gets confused easily. I've been very worried. I imagine you have been. The two men to Voss's left and right were both watching Caleb with the particular attention of men who were paid to watch. Caleb registered them, assessed them, and returned his attention to Voss. Mind if we look around, Voss said. Still pleasant, still smiling. Just to put my mind at ease. I do mind, actually, Caleb said. You want to look around my property, you come back with a warrant. Something changed behind Voss's eyes. Just for a moment, a half-second at most, and then the smile was back wider now, carrying an edge it hadn't had before. Well now, Voss said. That's an interesting response from a neighbor. It's the legal response, Caleb said. You were in contact with the law long enough to get yourself guardianship papers. You know what a warrant is. Voss tilted his head. She's a vulnerable child, Hargrove. I have legal responsibility for her well-being. Then file a missing persons report with the sheriff's office, Caleb said. That's how it works. Voss looked at him for a long beat. The pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned considerably, the way ice thins at the edges when the temperature starts to rise. I know you lost your boy, Voss said. His voice had gone quieter, gentler. I know what that does to a man. Makes him want to protect things, hold on to things. He paused. That's understandable, Caleb. It truly is. But that little girl has a home, and she has someone who cares for her, and whatever you think you know. I didn't say I knew anything, Caleb said. The quiet between them was different now. You didn't, Voss agreed. You're right. He gathered his reins. I'll leave you to your morning. The smile again, full and warm and completely false. But Caleb, I do hope you'll think carefully about the kind of trouble that comes with getting involved in things that aren't your business. This is a small county. It tends to be good to the people who get along and hard on the ones who don't. He turned his horse and rode south, and his two men followed without a word. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go, and didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Then he went inside. Earl was standing just back from the window. Lily was behind him against the far wall, holding the blanket around her shoulders. He's gone, Caleb said. Lily said, he knows. He suspects, Caleb said. That's different. He'll come back, she said. With the sheriff, probably. And then they'll make you give me back. Caleb crouched down so he was at her level. Not if I do what needs doing before then, he said. But I need a little time, Lily. Can you trust me for a little time? She looked at him the way she always looked at him, measuring, assessing that terrible, careful attention. Then she said, how much time? A day, he said. Maybe 2. She thought about it. As if it were a real negotiation. As if she were deciding whether the terms were acceptable. Okay, she said finally. But if he comes back before then, he will not get through that door, Caleb said, without going through me first. Wade Pruitt came that afternoon. Caleb heard the single rider before he saw him, and felt the particular quality of the hoofbeats, unhurried official, the gait of a man who believed the law was on his side and therefore had no reason to rush. He stepped out onto the porch and waited. Sheriff Pruitt was 45 thick through the middle, with a gray mustache and the air of a man who had held his position long enough to forget that it was meant to serve someone other than himself. He had a star on his chest and a piece of paper in his hand, and the expression of someone delivering inconvenience they've decided not to feel guilty about. Caleb, he said, pulling up. Wade. You know why I'm here? I can guess. Pruitt held up the paper. Harlan Voss has filed a report of a missing ward. Girl named Lily, age 4. He has legal guardianship signed by Judge Whitmore. He paused. He says she may be on your property. Does he? Caleb said. I need to ask you directly. Is she here? The two men looked at each other. Caleb had known Wade Pruitt for 2 years, not well, but well enough. Well enough to know that Pruitt wasn't a cruel man. He was a convenient one, which was sometimes worse. I want you to hear something before you finish that sentence, Wade, Caleb said, before you make whatever decision you've already more or less made. Pruitt waited. Ruth Calloway examined a child this morning, Caleb said. Burns on the palm, grip bruises on the upper arm, a healed laceration on the shoulder, malnourishment over an extended period. He said each item slowly, with the even pace of testimony. Ruth documented all of it, dated and signed, and Clara Heston spent 2 hours this morning telling me what she witnessed over 4 years in that house. He paused. You want to hand a child back to that Wade, you're going to have to look at that documentation first, and then explain to me and to Ruth and to Clara Heston and to everyone else in this county exactly why you did it. Pruitt's jaw was tight. I'm not harboring anyone, Caleb continued. I'm a private citizen on my own property. If you've got a warrant for a search, let me see it. If you don't, I'd ask you to ride back the way you came. Voss will push for a warrant, Pruitt said. You know that. Then let him push. That'll take time. And in that time, I'm going to be busy. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Something was working behind his eyes. The slow, grinding calculation of a man who was trying to figure out which side of a line was safer to be on. What are you planning to do? He said. Legal things, Caleb said. Entirely legal things. Pruitt turned his horse. He stopped after a few paces and looked back. I've got a job, Caleb, he said. It sounded almost like an apology. I know you do, Caleb said. I'm asking you to do it right. Pruitt rode south. By evening, Earl had ridden to the Calloway house and back with a message from Ruth Clara Heston, had agreed to put her account in writing, witnessed and signed. Ruth had also sent word to a man in Cheyenne, a lawyer named Aldous Grant, who had spent 20 years working federal cases and had, as Ruth's note put it, no love whatsoever for men who buy their courtrooms. Caleb sat at the table that night with the lamp burning and wrote out everything he knew in the clean, organized hand of a man who had written field reports for 11 years. He wrote what Lily had told him. He wrote what Ruth had found. He wrote what Clara had described. He documented the timeline of Voss's interactions with children in his care going back as far as Clara's memory reached. He wrote, and the house was quiet around him, and from the back room where Earl had set up a proper sleeping pallet, he could hear Lily's breathing slow and even the deep and absolute sleep of a child who had, for the first time in a long time, decided it was safe to let her guard down. He didn't know if he could keep that promise. He'd made it anyway because some promises are worth making, even when you can't guarantee them, because the alternative is leaving a 4-year-old child to believe that no one will ever say those words to her and mean them. He wrote until the lamp needed oil. He refilled it and kept writing. At some point past midnight, he heard a small sound from the back of the house. Footsteps light and careful, and then Lily appeared in the doorway, in the oversized wool socks, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and tangled from sleep. "You're still up," she said. "I am." "What are you doing?" "Writing down the truth," Caleb said. "So it can't be taken away. Can't be." She patted across the floor and stood beside his chair and looked at the pages spread across the table. She couldn't read them. She was 4 years old, but she studied them with great seriousness as if she were checking his work. "Will it help?" she said. "It's a start," Caleb said. She stood there another moment. Then she said, "Mr. Voss has a lot of money." "He does." "Money makes people listen to you." "Sometimes," Caleb said. "But the truth is louder than money if you say it in the right room." Lily considered this. "What's the right room?" "A courtroom," Caleb said. "In front of a judge who isn't owned by the man you're speaking against." She thought about that. "Is there a judge like that?" "I'm going to find one," Caleb said. She was quiet. Then she said, "Are you scared?" Caleb looked at the pages in front of him. He thought about Voss on horseback with that wide, empty smile. He thought about Pruitt's tight jaw. He thought about a boy whose whereabouts after leaving the Voss ranch were unconfirmed. "A little," he said honestly. "But I've been scared before, and it didn't stop me." Lily seemed to weigh this answer the way she weighed everything seriously, thoroughly, without hurrying. Then she said, "I'm going back to sleep." "Good idea." She turned back toward the hallway. She stopped. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb." She seemed to try the word out. "Thank you for the peaches." She went back down the hall, and her footsteps faded, and the house was quiet again. Caleb sat at the table with the lamp burning and the pages in front of him, and his hand still around the pen, and he didn't write anything for a long time. He just listened to the sound of her breathing from the back room, steady and slow, the sound of a child sleeping somewhere safe. Then he turned to a fresh page and kept writing. Somewhere south of here, Harlan Voss was making plans. So was Caleb. The letter from Aldous Grant arrived on the second morning. Earl brought it in from the road before full light, still sealed with a Cheyenne postmark and handwriting so precise it looked engraved. Caleb opened it at the kitchen table, while Lily was still sleeping, and read it twice without moving. Grant's message was short. He'd received Ruth's wire. He knew the name Harlan Voss, knew it specifically in connection with a land acquisition dispute 3 years prior that had involved falsified deed records and a county clerk who'd subsequently relocated to Colorado under circumstances Grant described as not entirely voluntary. He was not surprised to hear the name again. He would be in Millhaven in 4 days. He advised Caleb to speak to no one in the local court system and to document everything. The last line read, "Do not let that child out of your sight. Men like Voss do not wait patiently." Caleb folded the letter and put it inside his coat. 4 days. He was still thinking about that number when he heard hoofbeats from the south road. Not one horse this time. Several. Moving fast. He was on the porch before they came into view. 5 riders and Pruitt at the front, and behind Pruitt a man Caleb didn't recognize in a town suit and a flat-brimmed hat, carrying a document case under one arm. Voss wasn't with them. That was the detail Caleb noticed first, and it told him something. Voss had sent the law ahead, which meant Voss was letting the system work for him, which meant Voss believed the system would. He was probably right to believe that. Pruitt pulled up and didn't get off his horse. "I've got a court order, Caleb," he said. His voice had the flat, practiced neutrality of a man who'd made his decision and was done renegotiating it with himself. "Signed this morning by Judge Whitmore. It authorizes the return of the minor child to her legal guardian." "Let me see it," Caleb said. Pruitt passed the document down. Caleb read it. It was exactly what Pruitt had said. It was neat, official, stamped, signed. Whitmore's signature sat at the bottom, like a period at the end of a sentence that didn't leave room for argument. The man in the suit had dismounted. "Mr. Hargrove," he said in the clipped tone of someone who dealt in paperwork and found human beings inefficient by comparison. "I'm representing Mr. Voss's legal interests. This order requires your immediate compliance. Refusal constitutes obstruction of a court order and—" "I can read," Caleb said. He handed the order back to Pruitt. He looked at the 5 riders and at the man in the suit, and he kept his voice very level. "I want you to understand something before this goes any further," he said. "I have a signed and witnessed medical examination documenting injuries to that child consistent with deliberate abuse. I have a sworn written statement from a former employee of the Voss household describing a pattern of conduct going back 4 years. And I have a federal attorney traveling from Cheyenne who will be in this county in 4 days. He paused. "You execute that order today, you are returning an abused child to the man who abused her, and every one of you is going to have to account for that." The man in the suit started to speak. Pruitt held up one hand, and the man went quiet. Pruitt looked at Caleb. His jaw was working. "The order is legal, Caleb. The order is signed by a judge who has a 20-year friendship with the man requesting it," Caleb said. "That's going to be interesting for a federal attorney to look at." 4 days is a long time," the suit man said. "A lot can happen in 4 days." "Yes, it can," Caleb said. "I'm counting on it." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. The riders behind him hadn't moved. The morning was cold and clear, and nobody said anything, and the silence had a weight to it. The specific weight of a moment where things could go several different directions, and everyone present knew it. Then from inside the house, a sound. Small footsteps on the floorboards, and then Lily's voice carrying clearly through the closed door, "Caleb." Every person in that yard heard it. The man in the suit straightened. Two of the riders exchanged a look. Pruitt's face changed, just slightly, something in it that might have been discomfort. "I'm here," Caleb called back without raising his voice much. "Stay inside." A pause. Then, "Okay." Pruitt looked at his saddle horn. He looked at the court order in his hand. He looked at Caleb. 4 days, he said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't defiance. It was a man buying himself a little more time to figure out which side of this he could live with. 4 days, Caleb confirmed. Pruitt turned his horse. The suit man sputtered something about contempt and legal consequences, and Pruitt said, "Get back on your horse, Mr. Fenwick," in a tone that closed the subject, and they rode south. Caleb stood on the porch until they were gone. Then he went inside. Lily was standing in the middle of the main room with the blanket around her shoulders and her gray eyes very wide. "They came for me," she said. "They tried," Caleb said. "They'll come back." "Yes. And next time, Caleb said, "I'll have more to show them." He rode to town that afternoon alone, and he went to see Pastor Thomas Aldrich. Aldrich ran the Methodist church on the north end of Millhaven's Main Street, a lean, quiet man of 60, with the careful diction of someone who chose every word the way a carpenter chose wood for grain and weight, and how it would hold under pressure. He'd been in Millhaven for 20 years. He knew everyone. He was known to everyone. Caleb found him in the small office behind the sanctuary going over accounts, and said what he'd come to say without preamble. Aldrich listened without interrupting. He was very still. When Caleb finished, Aldrich folded his hands on the desk and looked at them for a moment. "I've had concerns about Harlan Voss," he said for some time. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind a man has when something doesn't add up," Aldrich said. "He's generous in public, visible in his charity, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that his generosity points inward." He paused. "Towards something he wants people to see, rather than something he actually feels." "Will you speak?" Caleb said. "Not about suspicions, about character, about what you've observed." Aldrich was quiet. "You're asking me to stand against a man who has significant influence in this community," he said, "who has on more than one occasion implied, not threatened, implied that the church's continued good standing in this county depended on his goodwill." "I know what I'm asking," Caleb said. Aldrich looked at him. "Ruth Calloway already spoke to me this morning," he said, "before you came." He opened his desk drawer and took out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this last night. I wasn't sure I'd be brave enough to give it to anyone." He slid it across the desk. "I suppose now I am." Caleb opened it. It was a carefully written account of 3 separate incidents over 2 years. A child seen at Voss's ranch with injuries Aldrich had noted and raised quietly with Voss and Voss's responses, which Aldrich had recorded verbatim with the instinct of a man who suspected he'd need them later. "This is good," Caleb said. "It isn't enough," Aldrich said. "No," Caleb agreed. "But it's another voice, and voices stack up." Aldrich leaned back in his chair. "There's a woman," he said slowly, "named Helen Marsh. She was a seamstress here until about a year and a half ago. She had a young nephew staying with her 8 or 9 years old. The boy did some work at the Voss ranch during the summer. He came home changed." Aldrich paused over that word. Quiet, withdrawn. "Helen took him to her sister in Denver. She told me the Sunday before she left that she would never let anyone know where they'd gone." He met Caleb's eyes. "She told me who she was afraid of." The room was very quiet. "Can you reach her?" Caleb said. "I sent a letter to Denver this morning," Aldrich said, "before you came." Caleb looked at this man across the desk, this quiet 60-year-old pastor who had been collecting evidence in careful handwriting because he'd known somewhere in the back of his careful mind that a day like this was coming. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Don't thank me," Aldrich said. I should have done more sooner. We all should have. The next blow came the following morning, and it came fast. Earl met Caleb at the barn door with a look on his face that Caleb had learned over 2 years meant something had gone sideways. "Man came by an hour ago," Earl said, "while you were in the back field, said he was from the land office in Cheyenne." A pause. "He had papers, said there's a lien filed against this property, going back 2 years, supposedly a disputed water rights agreement." Earl handed Caleb the documents. "Said if it's not resolved in 72 hours, the county can move to seize the property." Caleb took the papers. He read them. He read them again. "This is fabricated," he said. "I know it's fabricated," Earl said. "Question is what you're going to do about it." The water rights agreement referenced in the documents didn't exist. Caleb had bought this land outright clean title from a family named Brennan who'd relocated to Oregon. There had been no water rights dispute, no agreement, no lien. Someone had created this paperwork inside the system using the system's own language and stamps and procedures to manufacture a crisis with a 72-hour window. 72 hours. Aldous Grant would arrive in Millhaven in 3 days. The timing was not accidental. Caleb stood very still and thought about it. Then he said, "Saddle my horse." "Where are you going?" "To find out who filed this," Caleb said. "And who told them to." He rode to the land office in Millhaven and walked in without knocking, and put the papers on the desk of the county recorder, a thin young man named Jessup, who had the startled expression of someone who'd been expecting a different kind of Thursday. "I need to see the original filing for this lien," Caleb said. "The submission date, the filing party, the clerk who processed it." Jessup looked at the papers. He looked at Caleb. "I'd need to check them now," Caleb said. Jessup checked. He went through records with the nervous energy of someone who suspected he was about to find something he wished he hadn't. He went through them twice. He went through them a third time, and this time he stopped. "This filing," Jessup said carefully, "was submitted 3 days ago. The filing party is listed as the Millhaven County Water Authority." "Who chairs that authority?" Jessup's Adam's apple moved. "Mr. Voss serves as chair," he said. "He was appointed." "I know when he was appointed," Caleb said. "I need you to write down what you just told me. The filing date, the filing party, everything. Sign it." "Mr. Hargrove, I don't know if I should—" "Jessup." Caleb leaned on the counter. His voice was very quiet. "A man just tried to take a child who has burn marks on her hands and grip bruises on her arms, and when the law didn't move fast enough, he filed fraudulent paperwork against my property to remove me from it before a federal attorney arrives to examine his conduct. I need you to write down what you just told me. It is the truth. You are a county employee. You are supposed to serve the truth." Jessup looked at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he reached for his pen. By midday, Caleb had Jessup's signed statement in his coat pocket alongside Grant's letter and Aldrich's account, and Clara's testimony, and Ruth's medical documentation. He had 5 separate pieces of paper. Each one, a different voice saying a version of the same thing, and none of them enough on its own, but together building something that had weight and shape and the beginnings of a structure that could hold. He was 2 blocks from the land office when Voss stepped out of the general store directly in front of him. No riders this time. No lawyers. Just Harlan Voss in his coat, carrying a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm, as if he'd simply been doing his shopping. The 2 men stopped on the boardwalk 6 feet apart. "Caleb," Voss said. That smile. Always that smile, like a hand offered in friendship with a knife behind the back. "Harlan," Caleb said. "Heard you've been busy." "You heard right." Voss looked at him with something that was almost appreciation. "I want you to understand something," he said, dropping the pleasantness just enough to let Caleb see the edge underneath it. "I have been building in this county for 20 years. I have relationships, legal standing, and resources that you cannot match. I am not a man you want as an enemy." "I don't want anything from you," Caleb said. Except that child. Voss tilted his head. Why? He said. And for just a moment the performance fell away completely. And what was underneath it was worse. A genuine curiosity, cold and reptilian. The confusion of a man who truly did not understand why someone would spend this much on something that wasn't theirs. She's nothing to you. She's a ward. She's a child, Caleb said. And she walked 2 miles in January snow to get away from you. Something moved across Voss's face, gone in an instant. Children get confused, he said. They misunderstand discipline. Is that what it was? I have never done anything that wasn't within my legal rights as her guardian, Voss said. Everything I've done is documented and defensible and has been reviewed by a sitting judge. I know, Caleb said. I'm very interested in that judge. The smile finally dropped all the way. For the first time standing on a Millhaven boardwalk in the middle of the day, Caleb saw Harlan Voss without it. What was underneath was not rage. It was colder than rage, more deliberate. It was the expression of a man recalculating. You have no idea what you've started, Voss said. You're probably right, Caleb said. But I've finished things I didn't start before. I'm good at it. He walked past Voss and kept walking and didn't look back. Chete. The telegram came that evening. Earl brought it from the Millhaven telegraph office just before dark, and Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Lily sat across from him practicing letters on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil she'd found in the kitchen drawer. It was from Aldous Grant. It was 11 words Whitmore flagged. Federal Circuit aware, arriving tomorrow. Do not move, tomorrow. Not 4 days, tomorrow. Something had moved faster than Caleb expected. He read the telegram again and then set it face down on the table and sat very still, working out what it meant that Grant had accelerated. What it meant that the Federal Circuit was already aware of Whitmore, what had happened in the last 48 hours in Cheyenne, that Caleb didn't know about. What does it say? Lily asked. She was still working on her letters, tongue pressed to her upper lip with the effort of it. It says help is coming sooner than I thought, Caleb said. She looked up. Good sooner or bad sooner? Caleb looked at her, at this 4-year-old child working on her letters at his kitchen table, wearing his wool socks and eating his food and sleeping in his spare room, who had appeared at his door 2 days ago, with nothing but a cotton shift and a bone-deep knowledge of how dangerous people could be. Good sooner, he said. You sure? He wasn't entirely sure, but he said, yes, because some things you commit to before the evidence is complete, because the alternative is a kind of paralysis that helps no one. Lily looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back down at her paper and made a careful, slightly crooked letter L. That's the first letter of my name, she said. It is, Caleb said. Ruth showed me, she said. This morning while you were outside. She said I should learn it. She said it's mine, and nobody can take it. Caleb looked at the letter on the paper, small and crooked, and made with enormous concentration by a 4-year-old hand. She's right, he said. Outside the wind was picking up from the south. Inside, the lamp burned steady. Lily made another letter slower this time, more deliberate, and somewhere on the road from Cheyenne, a federal attorney was riding through the dark, carrying the kind of authority that money couldn't entirely buy and relationships couldn't entirely neutralize. But Harlan Voss knew he was coming. And Harlan Voss had spent 20 years making sure that in this county, knowing things first meant winning. The night was quiet. It wouldn't be for long. It wouldn't. Aldous Grant rode into Millhaven at 7 in the morning, and he looked nothing like what Caleb had expected. He was 52 short with wire-rimmed glasses, and a coat that had seen considerable travel, and a leather satchel so worn and overstuffed it looked like it might give out before its owner did. He had no riders with him, no official escort, no display of any kind. He tied his horse in front of the Millhaven boarding house, asked the woman at the desk where he could get coffee, and was sitting at a corner table with a cup and his satchel open when Caleb walked in 20 minutes later. Mr. Hargrove, Grant said without looking up from the document he was reading. Sit down. We have a great deal to cover and not as much time as I'd like. Caleb sat. Grant looked up. He had the kind of eyes that had spent decades reading things people tried to hide, small, sharp, permanently measuring. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at a structure he's deciding whether to trust with weight. Tell me everything, Grant said. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. I'll stop you when I need to, Caleb told him. He laid it out in the same order he'd written it Lily at the door. Ruth's examination, Clara's account, Aldrich's statement, Jessup's filing record, Voss on the boardwalk, the fraudulent lien. Grant stopped him 4 times to ask specific questions, each one precise and aimed at exactly the joint where the story was most under pressure. When Caleb finished, Grant set down his pen and picked up his coffee. The guardianship papers are the center of it, Grant said. Whitmore signed them, which means Whitmore is either corrupt or negligent, and in my experience with Judge Whitmore, it is emphatically the former. He paused. I have been watching Cornelius Whitmore for 3 years. This isn't the first time his name has appeared on documents that served Harlan Voss's interests. It is, however, the first time there's a child involved with documented injuries and multiple witnesses. He set down the cup. That changes the calculus considerably. What does that mean for today? Caleb said. It means I am filing an emergency petition this morning with the Federal Circuit to suspend Whitmore's authority over this specific matter and appoint a neutral reviewing judge. Grant pulled a document from the satchel. It also means I am filing a motion to invalidate the guardianship on the grounds of fraudulent procurement, specifically that Voss misrepresented the child's circumstances and his own fitness as a guardian to obtain that order. He looked at Caleb over his glasses. What it does not mean is that any of this is guaranteed. Voss has resources, and he will use them. His lawyer Fenwick, why assume? That's the name Pruitt used. Fenwick is competent and well-connected in the territorial court system. He will challenge everything I file, and he will do it quickly. Grant gathered the documents into a neat stack. I need every piece of paper you have. Ruth Calloway's examination, Clara Heston's statement, Aldrich's account, Jessup's filing record. I need them in the next hour. I have them here, Caleb said, and pulled the folded papers from his coat. Grant took them. He read each one in full without hurrying. When he finished, he said something that Caleb hadn't expected. This is enough, he said. This is actually enough. Not to guarantee an outcome, nothing guarantees an outcome. But this is enough to force a proper hearing, and a proper hearing is all we need. He looked at Caleb steadily. Because in a proper hearing in front of a judge who doesn't owe Harlan Voss a single thing, the truth of what that child has been living with will be visible to everyone in that courtroom. Caleb said, How long until a hearing? I'm going to push for 48 hours, Grant said. Voss's team will push back. It'll probably be 72. He paused. Can you keep her safe for 3 more days? Yes, Caleb said. Grant nodded. He closed the satchel. One more thing, he said, and I want you to hear this clearly. Voss is going to escalate. When men like him feel the system starting to turn against them, they don't wait for the verdict, they try to change the conditions before the verdict can happen. He may make another move on the property. He may go after your witnesses. A pause. He may try to take the child directly. The word directly sat on the table between them like a stone. Let him try, Caleb said. Grant looked at him with the careful eyes. I'm not saying that to frighten you, he said. I'm saying it because you need to be prepared for a man doing something that stops making legal sense and starts making desperate sense. He stood. I've seen it before. When the walls close in, they stop thinking about consequence. Caleb stood too. Mr. Grant, he said, I spent 11 years as a federal marshal. I have sat across from men who stopped thinking about consequence. I know what that looks like, and I know what to do about it. Grant held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, Good. He picked up his satchel. I'll have the petition filed before noon. I'll send word when the hearing is confirmed. He walked out, and Caleb watched him go, and thought that Aldous Grant was exactly the kind of man you wanted on your side, unimpressive to look at, and absolutely immovable once he'd decided where to stand. The escalation came faster than either of them had predicted. It came that same afternoon, and it didn't come through the law. Caleb was at the ranch when Earl came in from the road at a pace that told him something was wrong before Earl said a word. "Clara Heston," Earl said. "Someone broke into her sister's house this morning, while they were both out, tore the place apart." "Was anything taken?" "Her sister says no, nothing of value." Earl met his eyes. "But Clara's written statement, the copy she kept, is gone." Caleb stood very still. "Is Clara all right?" "Shaken. Her sister's furious." Earl paused. "Clara says she's not going to testify. She's scared, Caleb. She's talking about leaving town." Caleb reached for his coat. "Where is she?" He drove Earl's wagon into town because it was faster than saddling up, and he went to the sister's house on the east side and knocked, and Maud opened the door with the expression of a woman who had moved well past fear and arrived at anger. Clara was in the kitchen. She was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, and she turned when Caleb came in, and her face was the face of someone who had made a decision and was trying to hold on to it. "I can't do this," she said before he'd spoken. "I have nowhere to go if I have nothing. I can't be the one who—" "Clara," Caleb said. He kept his voice level. "Look at me." She looked at him. "He sent someone to steal a piece of paper," Caleb said. "Do you understand what that means? It means he's afraid of what's on it. It means your words have weight. If they didn't, he would have ignored them." He paused. "He is not ignoring them. He is afraid of them." Clara's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright with something that was equal parts fear and fury. "I gave you my statement," she said. "You have it." "I do. And Grant has a copy filed with the Federal Circuit. That copy cannot be stolen." He took a step toward her. "But Clara, I need you to stand up in a courtroom and say it, out loud, in front of people. A piece of paper is evidence. Your voice is testimony. They are not the same thing." "He'll destroy me," she said. "Whatever he has to do." "He will try," Caleb said. "I won't let him." "You can't promise that," she said. "You promised that little girl too, and you can't guarantee it for her either." That landed. He felt it land. She was right, he couldn't guarantee any of it. No one in this situation could promise certainty because certainty wasn't available, and she was smart enough to know it. "No," he said, "I can't guarantee it. What I can tell you is that if you don't stand up, he wins. He wins today, and he wins tomorrow, and he wins the day after that. And some other child ends up in that house." He held her gaze. "Is that something you can live with? Because I watched you sit at that table and tell me what you saw. I watched your hands shake while you told it. You have been living with it already." Clara looked at the table. Her hands were still. After a long moment, she said, "I want someone with me, at the courthouse." "You'll have me," Caleb said, "and Ruth, and Aldrich. And if he tries anything, we will deal with it." He paused. "Clara, you already did the hard part. You already survived living in that house and watching what happened and carrying it alone for 2 years. Standing up in a courtroom is easier than that. I promise you that part is easier." Clara looked at him. Then she looked at her sister, who had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen the whole time, and Maud gave her the small nod of a woman who had already done her own calculating. "All right," Clara said. "All right." The hearing was confirmed that evening. 72 hours, as Grant had predicted, a federal circuit judge named Harlan Moss, traveling from Laramie, who had no existing relationship with Whitmore, and whose record Grant described in his wire as clean experienced and temperamentally inclined toward the protection of children. Caleb read the wire at the kitchen table. Lily was asleep in the back room. Earl was in the bunkhouse. The lamp burned low, and the house was quiet, and Caleb sat with the wire in his hand and felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first faint suggestion that the ground might hold. 3 days. He was pouring water for the stove when he heard the horse. One horse moving quietly, not on the main road, coming from the east across the field, the way someone moves when they don't want to be heard from the road. Caleb set down the pot. He moved to the window without lighting anything, without making a sound. A rider stopped at the edge of the property just outside the fence line, sitting still, watching the house. Caleb went to the back room. He put his hand on Earl's shoulder once, and Earl was awake instantly, the way a man is awake who spent his life knowing that the sound that wakes you might be important. "Rider at the east fence," Caleb said quietly. "One man." Earl was already sitting up. "Armed?" "Can't tell. Don't move and don't light anything." He went back to the window. The rider hadn't moved, just watching, which told Caleb this was surveillance, not a direct approach, Voss sending someone to map the property. Count the people confirmed that Lily was still here. Caleb watched the watcher for 10 minutes. Then the rider turned and rode east back the way he'd come and was absorbed by the dark. Caleb stood at the window for a long time after. Voss was measuring the distance between where he was and what he was going to lose. On the second day, 2 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was Helen Marsh. Aldrich's letter to Denver had reached her. She arrived in Millhaven on the morning stage, a small, composed woman in her 40s with a nephew named Daniel, who was 11 now, and who had not spoken Harlan Voss's name in 2 years, not once, not to anyone. She came with her own written account, meticulous and dated, and she sat down with Grant in the boarding house for 2 hours. And when she came out, her face had the particular expression of someone who has set down something very heavy after carrying it a very long time. She came to the ranch that afternoon. She stood on the porch and looked at Caleb and said, "I left because I was afraid, and I am still afraid. But I am more afraid of what happens if that man never has to answer for it." "Come in," Caleb said. "I'll make coffee." She came in. And Lily, who had been sitting at the kitchen table with her letters, looked up at this woman she'd never seen and studied her the way she studied everything. Helen Marsh looked at Lily, and her face did something complicated and quiet, and then she said, "Hello, sweetheart." "Hello," Lily said, and went back to her letters. Helen looked at Caleb. "How long has she been?" "Working on her letters," Caleb said. "2 days." Helen pressed her lips together, nodded, sat down. The second thing was Pruitt. He rode out to the ranch alone late in the afternoon, and he dismounted when Caleb came out, and he didn't have any papers in his hand this time. "I need to talk to you," Pruitt said, "not as the sheriff, as a man." "All right," Caleb said. Pruitt took off his hat. He looked at it. He was a man doing visible, painful work on himself, and Caleb gave him the time to do it. "I've been to see Ruth," Pruitt said. "She showed me the examination, the whole thing, everything she documented." He stopped. "I have children," he said. 2 girls, 12 and 14. He stopped again. "I have been telling myself for 2 years that Harlan Voss was a difficult man who was nonetheless within his legal rights. I have been telling myself that the law is the law, and my job is to enforce it." He looked up. "I was wrong." "Yes," Caleb said. "You were." Pruitt flinched, but he didn't look away. "I can't undo what I didn't do," he said. "But I can tell you that at that hearing, if anyone asks me whether the court order I brought to your property was obtained through proper and ethical process, I am going to tell the truth." He paused. "Voss called me this morning. He wanted me to go to the boarding house and find a reason to detain Grant." He put his hat back on. "I told him I wouldn't do that." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "What did he say?" "He said I'd regret it." "And—" Pruitt's jaw set. "I've been regretting things I didn't do for 2 years," he said. "I'd rather regret something I did." He got back on his horse. He rode north, not south, which Caleb noticed, not back toward town, not toward Voss's ranch, just north and away, a man needing road under him to process what he'd just decided. Caleb went back inside. "Who was that?" Lily asked. She was still at the table. She'd graduated from letters to her name. She had Lily written in large, careful capitals on the paper in front of her, slightly crooked but fully legible. "A man who changed his mind," Caleb said. About what? About which side he was on. Lily looked at the door, then back at her paper. "Is that good?" "Very good," Caleb said. She considered this. Then she wrote Lily again, smaller this time, more controlled, and held the paper up to look at it. "I wrote my name," she said. "I see that," Caleb said. "It's mine," she said. "Ruth said so." "Ruth's right," Caleb said. "It's yours." She looked at the paper for another moment. Then she set it down and picked up the pencil again and started practicing the letters of a second word, slowly, carefully, with all the concentration of someone who has recently discovered that words can belong to you, that you can put them on paper, and they stay there, that no one can take them back. Caleb watched her work and didn't say anything else. Outside, the sky was moving toward evening, and in 36 hours, a federal judge named Harlan Moss would walk into the Millhaven courthouse, and Harlan Voss, for the first time in 20 years in this county, would walk into a room where the rules did not belong to him. The paper on the table said, "Lily," in 2 different sizes, both of them hers. That was enough for tonight. The morning of the hearing, Lily woke up before anyone else. Caleb found her at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light, sitting very straight, both hands flat on the wood, staring at nothing. She'd dressed herself the clothes Ruth had brought 2 days ago, a proper dress in dark blue wool, too big at the shoulders, but clean and whole. She'd combed her own hair. She was wearing the wool socks still because they were warmer than the shoes Ruth had brought, and she'd decided that on her own, without asking anyone. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "That makes 2 of us." He went to the stove and got the fire going. "You hungry?" "Not really." "You should eat anyway." He found the bread Ruth had brought and cut 2 slices and put them on the iron pan. "Today's going to be long." Lily watched him work. "Will I have to go?" she said. "To the courthouse." "No," Caleb said. "You stay here with Earl. The hearing is for adults." She was quiet for a moment. "What if the judge says I have to go back?" Caleb turned from the stove. He looked at her directly, the way he'd learned she needed straight on, no softening, no talking around it. "Then we appeal," he said. "And while we appeal, you stay here. Grant has already filed paperwork that prevents any transfer of custody until the federal circuit rules. That could take weeks, maybe longer." He paused. "You are not going anywhere today. I need you to believe that." She looked at him with those measuring gray eyes. "I believe you," she said. And it wasn't the automatic answer of a child placating an adult. It was the considered conclusion of someone who had spent a week gathering evidence and had reached a verdict. He put the bread in front of her. She ate it. They rode into Millhaven at 8 o'clock, Caleb and Ruth in the wagon, Grant on horseback alongside. Clara Heston was already at the courthouse steps when they arrived, standing with her sister Maud and with Helen Marsh beside her, and the 3 women had the particular posture of people who are frightened and have decided to be there anyway. Aldrich was on the steps too, hat in hand, and he nodded at Caleb when they came up. Pruitt was standing at the courthouse door in his sheriff's capacity, and he held it open when they came through, and he met Caleb's eyes as he passed and gave one small, tight nod. The courtroom was fuller than Caleb had expected. He hadn't anticipated how many people would come. Millhaven was a small town, 140 families, give or take, and word had moved through it the way word moves through small places, which is to say, completely and fast. The benches were lined with people Caleb knew by sight, and some he knew by name, farmers, merchants, women who did laundry, and women who ran boarding houses, men who cut timber, and men who drove cattle. They sat with the quiet, watchful attention of people who understood that something important was happening and had decided they wanted to witness it. Voss was already seated at the respondents' table with Fenwick beside him. He was wearing his best coat, and his posture was correct, and his face was arranged in the expression of a man wrongly inconvenienced patient and faintly aggrieved. He did not look at Caleb when Caleb came in. Fenwick looked at Grant with the specific wariness of a man who had done his research overnight and didn't like what he'd found. Grant set his satchel on the petitioner's table and opened it with the calm of a man arranging his kitchen, and Caleb sat beside him and put his own folded papers on the table and waited. Judge Harlan Moss came in at 8:30 exactly. He was 68, gray-haired with a broad face, and the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that rushing produced errors and that errors had consequences. He sat. He looked at both tables. He looked at the room. "I have reviewed the petition," he said without preamble. "I have reviewed the original guardianship documents and the circumstances of their procurement. I have reviewed the Federal Circuit's notation regarding Judge Whitmore." He set down the papers. "I want to be very clear about what this hearing is and what it is not. This is not a criminal proceeding. That is a separate matter, and it will be addressed separately. This hearing is specifically to determine the welfare of a minor child and the validity of the guardianship order currently in effect." He looked at both tables. "Mr. Grant, you may begin."
Jakyam.
Grant was precise and unhurried and utterly without theatrics, which turned out to be more devastating than theatrics would have been. He entered Ruth's examination first. He read the findings aloud, not quickly, not dramatically, but at the pace of a man who wanted every person in that room to hear each item separately and understand what it meant. Burns on the right palm. Grip bruises on the upper arm. A healed laceration on the shoulder. Extended malnourishment. The room was very quiet. Fenwick objected twice during the reading. Both times, Moss overruled him with a single word and a look that communicated clearly that further interruptions of this nature would be unwelcome. Then Grant called Clara Heston. She walked to the front of the room with her hands clasped together and her chin level, and she sat down and looked at Grant, and she told the truth. She told it in plain specific language with dates where she had them and approximate times where she didn't, and she described what she had seen in the Voss household over 4 years with the flat, steady voice of a woman who had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it completely. When she described the afternoon, she had seen Lily crying in the kitchen and had found the burn on her hand and confronted Voss. The room made a sound. Not loud, just a collective breath, the sound of a group of people absorbing something they hadn't been sure they wanted to know. Voss at his table made a small motion toward Fenwick. Fenwick leaned over and they exchanged 3 words. Then Fenwick stood for cross-examination. He was careful and controlled. He challenged Clara's memory, her motivations, her departure from the ranch. He suggested in the smooth language of a skilled legal mind that a former employee with grievances might have reasons to misremember or mischaracterize events. Clara looked at him and said, "I have nothing to gain from being here. I have a great deal to lose. I'm here because a 4-year-old child walked 2 miles in January snow to get away from that man, and I spent 4 years not doing enough to stop him, and this is the only way I know to make that mean something." Fenwick had no follow-up question. Helen Marsh came next. She was briefer than Clara. She had less time in the house, less direct observation, but what she had was specific, and it landed differently because it was a second voice saying a version of the same thing, and a second voice transforms a story into a pattern. When she finished, Voss's lawyer was writing quickly on a notepad. Then Grant did something Caleb hadn't expected. He stood and said, "Your Honor, I would like to call Sheriff Wade Pruitt." The room shifted. Caleb felt it a change in the air like pressure dropping before weather. Voss went very still at his table. Fenwick's pen stopped moving. Pruitt walked to the front with his hat in his hands and his star on his chest, and the expression of a man who had settled something with himself and was now living in the aftermath of that settlement. Grant said, "Sheriff Pruitt, the court order you delivered to the Hargrove property, the order directing the return of the child to Mr. Voss, can you tell the court how that order was obtained?" Pruitt said, "Mr. Voss contacted Judge Whitmore directly and requested the order be issued on an expedited basis outside of normal filing procedure. Was that request routed through your office? No. Were you consulted about the welfare of the child before the order was issued? No. Were you aware of any investigation into the child's welfare prior to executing the order? Pruitt paused. One beat. I had been made aware of concerns, he said. I did not act on them adequately. The courtroom was very quiet. Did Mr. Voss at any point contact you to request actions outside the scope of normal law enforcement procedure? Grant said. Fenwick was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor, scope. Overruled, Moss said. Answer the question, Sheriff. Pruitt looked at the judge. Yes, he said. 2 days ago. He asked me to find a reason to detain Mr. Grant. The sound the room made this time was different, louder. Someone in the back benches said something to the person beside them that carried the word Lord clearly enough for the front of the room to hear. Voss turned and looked at Pruitt. It was a long, flat look, the look of a man who had expected loyalty and was recalculating what its absence would cost him. Pruitt looked back at him and didn't look away. Fenwick's defense was professional, and it was not enough. He challenged the documentation. He challenged the witnesses' credibility. He presented character witnesses of his own 3 men from town who attested to Voss's generosity and standing men whose names Caleb recognized as men with land deals and business arrangements connected to Voss's operations. They said what they'd been brought to say, and they said it competently, and the room listened with the polite skepticism of people who had just heard something that had already changed the frame. Voss himself testified. He was controlled and reasonable, and he used the word misunderstanding 4 times, and the word concerned 6 times, and he looked at the judge with the full force of that practiced, wide-eyed sincerity, the performance he had given in every room he'd walked into for 20 years. Moss watched him with the expression of a man who had heard that performance before and knew exactly what it was. When Fenwick finished, Grant stood for his closing. Your Honor, he said, the question before this court is not whether Harlan Voss has the right documentation. He does. The question is whether that documentation was obtained honestly and whether the welfare of the child it governs has been served. He paused. A 4-year-old child walked 2 miles in January snow barefoot at midnight to escape that man's house. A physician documented what that child's body showed. 3 witnesses with direct knowledge of the Voss household described a pattern, not an incident. And a sitting law enforcement officer has testified that Mr. Voss attempted to obstruct federal legal process 2 days ago. Another pause. The documentation exists. What it represents is fraud. The guardianship exists. What it has produced is harm. This court has the authority and the obligation to say so. He sat down. The room was completely still. Moss looked at his papers. He looked at Voss's table. He looked at the room. I'm going to recess for 1 hour, he said. I will have my ruling when I return. The hour was the longest of Caleb's life, and he had lived through some long hours. He sat on the bench outside the courtroom with Ruth on one side and Clara on the other, and nobody said much because there wasn't much to say that would help. Grant worked at a small table in the hallway, writing already preparing for whatever came next, in whatever direction it came. Aldrich sat with his hands folded and his eyes closed, and Caleb wasn't sure if he was praying or simply resting, and decided it didn't matter. Clara said at one point, I keep thinking about what I should have done differently. Don't, Ruth said. You're here now. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does, Ruth said. Do it anyway. Caleb looked at the closed courtroom doors and thought about Lily at the kitchen table that morning, sitting very straight hands, flat on the wood, dressed and ready for a day she wasn't going to be present for. He thought about the paper on the table, with Lily written in 2 different sizes. He thought about a pine box and a note on a kitchen table, and the particular silence of a house from which everything meaningful has been removed. He thought about a scratch at the door at midnight, low and desperate like a wounded animal too tired to cry. He had opened the door. Whatever happened in the next hour, he had opened the door. That was permanent. That could not be undone. The courtroom doors opened. Moss took his seat. He set down his papers. He looked at the room with the unhurried attention of a man about to say something that would matter. "I have reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony," he said. "I find the following. The guardianship order signed by Judge Whitmore was obtained through improper procedure and without adequate investigation into the minor child's welfare or the fitness of the petitioner. The medical evidence presented is credible, thorough, and consistent across multiple examinations. The witness testimony is credible and corroborated. The pattern of conduct described is serious, sustained, and harmful." He paused. "I am hereby invalidating the guardianship order in its entirety. The minor child designated as Lily will not be returned to the custody of Harlan Voss." He said several more things. He said them clearly and on the record. He referenced the fraudulent lien. He referenced Pruitt's testimony. He said that he was referring the matter to the Federal Circuit for criminal investigation and that all documentation would be forwarded accordingly. Caleb heard most of it. He also heard the sound the room made, not a cheer, not a shout. Something quieter and more substantial than that, the sound of a group of people exhaling something they'd been holding for a long time without knowing they were holding it. Clara was crying. Ruth had her hand. Fenwick was gathering papers at the respondent's table with the focused efficiency of a man removing himself from a situation. Voss sat still for a moment, one long still moment, and then he stood and he straightened his coat, and he walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Two men from the federal marshal's office were waiting for him in the hallway. Caleb heard the exchange from where he was sitting. Brief, official, the sound of a door closing on something. Grant appeared at Caleb's elbow. "The criminal referral will move quickly," he said in his quiet, precise way. "Given the documentation and Pruitt's testimony, I expect formal charges within a month, possibly sooner." He paused. "The child needs permanent placement. We should discuss." "I know," Caleb said. Grant looked at him. "Do you?" Caleb looked at the door where Voss had walked out. He looked at Clara, still crying with Ruth's hand on her back. He looked at Aldrich, who was standing now talking quietly to Helen Marsh, and at Pruitt by the wall, who was looking at the floor with the expression of a man taking a full accounting of himself. "I know," Caleb said again. He drove back to the ranch alone, faster than he'd come. Earl was on the porch when he pulled in, and he looked at Caleb's face and said, "Well, it's done," Caleb said. Earl sat back. He let out a long, slow breath. "Lord," he said quietly, not an exclamation, a word of genuine address. "Where is she?" "Inside. She's been working on her letters all morning." A pause. "She asked me twice what time it was." Caleb went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table. The paper in front of her had letters across the whole top, her name several times, and below it, other letters she'd been practicing, and below those, a shape that might have been an attempt at a word she didn't know yet. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face did something complicated. "Well," she said, it was exactly what Earl had said. Caleb understood that they had both been using those 4 hours to prepare for either answer. "He can't take you back," Caleb said. "It's over. The judge ruled." Lily looked at him. She looked at the paper. She looked back at him. "What happens now?" she said. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He hadn't thought past the hearing that was the truth. He'd thought only as far as the next necessary thing, and the next necessary thing, and the next, which was how he'd survived the last 3 years, and how he'd gotten through this week, and now the necessary things had run out, and he was sitting across from a 4-year-old child who was asking a real question that deserved a real answer. "I don't know exactly," he said. "There are legal things that have to happen. Papers. A process." He paused. "But I know you're not going back there. And I know you're not going anywhere you don't want to go." Lily looked at him. "Could I stay here?" she said. Her voice was careful, the way her letters were careful, deliberate, precise, as if she'd measured the risk and decided it was worth it. "If I wanted to." Caleb looked at her. He thought about the house after Thomas, the silence of it, the specific weight of absence, the way he'd been sitting in it, not because he wanted to, but because leaving felt like one more abandonment of a boy who was already past being abandoned. He thought about a scratch at the door at midnight. He thought about peaches in a tin cup. He thought about Lily written in 2 different sizes on a piece of paper. "And it's mine," said with the stunned, serious wonder of someone discovering ownership for the first time. "Yeah," he said. "You could stay here." Lily looked down at the paper. She picked up the pencil. She wrote Lily again at the bottom of the page, the clearest version yet, straight and even and fully unmistakably hers. Then she looked up at him and said, "Okay." That was all. No ceremony, no drama. Just one small word from one small girl who had walked 2 miles in January snow to find a door worth knocking on. And Caleb Hargrove, who had not had a reason to stay careful in 3 years, looked at that word and felt it settle into him like the first warm day after a winter that had gone on too long, quiet and certain and completely permanently real. He had opened the door. She had walked through it, and in the only way that had ever mattered, they had both finally come home,